Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started. Sorry, I should say good afternoon. It is 12:05. Hello, my name's Ellie. I'm the project coordinator at Transformation Cornwall. I was asked to chair this workshop at the last minute, at the end of last week. So I would like to thank you in advance for your patience as I do my best to guide us through the programme. Now, I'm not the only change to today's agenda. Unfortunately, Brian Cuthbertson from the Diocese of London pulled out of his presentation on Friday due to ill health, but I am completely confident that our new presenter, Mike Sturgis, is going to make for fascinating listening and learning. So thank you very much, Mike, for stepping in to share your experiences with us today. And thank you to Dr. Tim Jones, who will be our first speaker in a moment. So just a few bits of housekeeping as we get started. It would be great if we could remain muted until we reach the Q&A sections of today's session, but do feel free to use the chat function at any time to throw down your thoughts or questions or queries. My wonderful colleague Sam is also online, and he's going to be helping me out by keeping an eye on the chat box. We are recording today's Zoom, and we hope to be able to share it with others, so please do not swear. I thought it would be quite interesting for us to know who's on the call today, but without taking the time to go around everybody. So I've just pulled together a little list, which I will share with you now, I hope. There we go. I'm sorry there isn't lots of detail on there, but I just thought you will hopefully recognise some of the names of the other organisations and churches and communities that are represented today, and be interested to see who has signed up to this workshop along with yourself. A quick look at our agenda. We're going to be together until 1:30, and the plan is that we will start off with Tim's presentation. We'll then have questions for Tim. We'll then hear from Mike, who is Treasurer and Creation Care Champion at St Martin's Church, Liskeard. And then we'll have questions for Mike, but I'm sure it'll be okay if you've also got a question for Tim when we get to the end of our time together. And then I'll talk to you briefly about next steps and how to take today's learning forward together with some help from Transformation Cornwall. I think that's all I wanted to say. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tim, and we will get that presentation shared on the screen. So I will stop sharing.
And I will try to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that okay. Great. Okay, good morning. So as Al said, my name is Tim Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of Community Energy Plus. We are Cornwall's energy advice agency. We're based in Truro. A lot of our work is focused around supporting individual householders with their energy needs, addressing the real problems with fuel poverty we have in Cornwall, and also helping people start to make the transition to a low carbon future. Just as a start, I've put up on that screen two of the booklets that we're currently distributing to households around the county. Both of them are on our website as PDF files. Obviously, at this point, when there's a lot of people who are very anxious about their energy costs and how they're coping to keep warm, both of these booklets have been very helpful to people. The one with a sort of blue background has got a lot of the summary of all the help that's been made available to people through the government various programs over the winter months. And I know probably some of you are involved with provision of warmth centres, and we're getting these booklets out to people through them and any means possible, because obviously we're very conscious that we've got a lot of very anxious people living in Cornwall. The broad scope of what we do, as I said, mostly focused around domestic households, but we also provide energy advice and support to people with small businesses and community buildings as well. And so over the years, we've worked with a number of organisations around the county, improving their energy footprints. So what I wanted to do just as a start is just to sort of explain our basic approach when we start to talk about energy and sustainability issues moving to low carbon. And I always start and don't make any assumptions about what people know, and suggest that if you're thinking about this for buildings that you've got responsibility for, you need to understand the energy hierarchy. Often I end up having conversations with people where we end up at the end of the process and start to talk about renewable energy without understanding the basics first. So the first start of an energy hierarchy is, and I appreciate for some this might be going back over very old familiar ground, but it's worth repeating. The best way of managing energy is to use less, and to do things like turn it off. It's quite shocking how often I come across situations where people are talking about, worried about their energy use, and then you see lights on and bits of kit plugged in and on chargers, and it's an old standby. You know, the best energy saving is not using it at all. So that simple reminder of turning it off, turning it down, certainly not using things on standby is the starting point. Once we've reduced that unnecessary usage, it's then to ask about how can we use things more efficiently, and very much part of that is understanding the energy that is being used, and then talking about insulation, and I'll come onto that in a bit more detail in a moment. Once we've become more efficient in our energy use, that's the point that we can start to think about low carbon renewable technologies. And it's important to get it in that order. As I said, I've had several conversations over the past few months as people have been very anxious about managing their energy bills. And the first starting point of that conversation has been, I'm thinking about putting solar PV photovoltaic panels on the rooftop. And then when we unpack that conversation, we're finding lots of energy being wasted and being used unnecessarily. And it's important to get this order first. So that idea about being efficient, I think a key point is about asking the right questions to start with. And whatever building you've got a responsibility for, understanding when energy is being used in your building on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and seasonally to build up a picture is important. So you understand in your building which are those that are eating energy. And I think we've all been in our own homes because of rapidly rising prices, having to ask these questions. So the big ticket items that probably are going to be heating systems, and if you've got cooking facilities in your buildings, those are going to be the energy hungry ones, but also things that take a small but constant draw is important to note. And particularly if you've got things like fridges running, those understanding their usage is important. And so to help measure that, one of the things I do recommend that we now pick up and make a bit better use of the technology available is smart plugs. And these are fairly low cost items. Usually you can pick them up for between sort of 15 and 20 pounds. And the one I've illustrated there, the Tapo, basically will link to a smartphone, and with a smartphone app you can then start to measure what a particular device is using when it's drawing, and that can be really helpful to understand particularly unexpected energy consumption, that you get a better feel for it. If you depends on where you source these goods, but often I use Amazon as a good starting point to understand what's available. If you put smart plug with energy monitoring, it's important you have the energy monitoring bit in there. That will give you a series of options. And the idea of using the app is you start to build up consumption data. The other device that is worth considering is getting a smart meter fitted, both in terms of your community buildings and domestic properties as well. The rollout of smart meters is still underway. It's not been quite as successful as the government had wanted, but a smart meter has a couple of benefits in terms of the conversation about managing energy. One, you will get much more precise meter readings off a smart meter, but also using the in-home displays that provide, you can get much more accurate time of use consumption data. And one of the bits I often encourage people to think about when if they get one fitted is to play the game where you switch everything off in your home, literally turn everything off, and then see what current is still being drawn and shown on your smart meter, because often that can be a surprise. You know, the bits that have been left behind cupboards or under beds in homes, it's quite surprising what things get drawn. But then to switch things on one at a time to see the impact they have on the current that's being drawn. So you have that understanding of how your energy is being used. Now, I do appreciate in terms of the people that are on this call today, you will have older buildings to manage. And so energy advice in older buildings is often a challenge because obviously they were designed at a time when thought for energy efficiency wasn't perhaps at the forefront. And I tend to point people in a number of different directions for help. There's lots of help out there. And the first is Historic England. We were involved a while ago with the report that I've linked to here, where they've been looking at the use of heat pumps in historic buildings. And I said to Elle at the start, I've got a copy of this report and I'm quite happy to circulate it to you because it's quite an informative one about how Historic England have tackled the issue of heat pumps in old buildings. One of the concerns that often people have about using a heat pump is you really do need a thermally efficient property to get the best out of it. And Historic England have done some really good research around how they can be fitted, how they can be sized, how they are then managed to get the best out of them. The second source is Cornwall Council. And we were involved probably about 18 months ago in developing an advice guide. This is targeted to people who rent properties, but actually the advice in the leaflet is quite useful for anyone who has got an historic building, and particularly from the council's point of view, sets out what you can and what you can't do when you need permissions, when the council will give you permitted development rights to make improvements. So this leaflet is available for download on our website and also on the council's website. And the council's conservation officers are often, well, one, they're often very busy, but they are a good source of support and advice if you can get hold of them. And the third direction I'd point you is the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. If you've not come across SPAB before, I would thoroughly recommend you check out the website. The picture of the book I've put up, I use quite a lot in advice provision that we provide. It gives a whole host of recommendations right the way across for buildings maintenance, but done in a very ecologically sound way, but also, you know, sensitive to the demands of older buildings. So I think underlining all of this, I would say from an energy point of view, if you have questions and concerns, please ask. We as an advice agency, if we don't know the answers, we will always point people to others that we know of. It's always, we'll always find someone that has got some expertise on the subject that is being questioned. So when we start to talk about energy management, I always recommend we take a fabric first approach, which goes back to the energy hierarchy. And although it's boring, I really push, we've got to insulate. Now, I appreciate the image I'm going to put up there is of typical domestic property, but it applies to community buildings and churches and other structures as well. The key bit in this, which I think a lot of people possibly don't understand, the physics of buildings, a lot of heat escapes through the walls, as I'm sure if you're managing an older building, you'll appreciate. Cutting down the drafts, dealing with the heat that escapes through roof spaces is important, but walls need to be treated and managed appropriately, because they are actually where most of the heat will escape from in terms of a typical domestic building. And so obviously if you're putting heat into a space to keep it comfortable and usable, you want to keep it there. Now, treating walls in older buildings where they're solid construction does get complicated. It's not straightforward. It does require professional advice and input. I won't downplay the complexities of it, from domestic properties right the way across all sorts of different properties. But unless we're treating the walls, obviously we do a lot of work around keeping the water out and keeping them dry and thinking about water penetration, but equally we need to think about heat traveling in the other direction. And I'm quite happy to take some questions around that for your specific buildings as we proceed through this webinar. So the key bit I wanted just to talk a little about and touch on, obviously, because it's the bit that is coming up increasingly, both within the domestic market and for community buildings, is the issue about heat. I think we all now are very familiar with putting solar panels on roofs to generate electricity, and we're familiar with wind turbines in the landscape. The big thing that has been put into the hard to tackle category has been how we take fossil fuels out of the way that we heat. So we're all familiar with oil boilers and gas boilers, whether that's mains gas or LPG bottled or supplied in bulk into tanks. Over the next 10 years, we are going to see significant change in how we heat properties. Lots of attention is being put onto heat pumps. So that's basically taking heat either from the air, as in this picture, that's a standard air source heat pump, or from the ground using boreholes or slinkies that are buried into the ground. That heat is taken into the heat pump. It works basically in the reverse of a fridge. So it's putting heat, compresses, puts heat into a heat exchanger, usually for a heat pump. Most commonly, it's then connected to a hot water system, so either radiators, underfloor heating, that sort of thing. And so we describe them as air to water systems. With air source heat pumps, we can also put them into blowers, so they can work as an air to air system. And for some public spaces like community buildings, I think air to air heat pumps is often a very practical solution, certainly much cheaper than putting in a ground source heat pump, and worth considering. It's effectively an air conditioning system, and some of the more sophisticated air source heat pumps with air to air systems will also act as cooling systems. So you can use them as air conditioning, and also they will have a dehumidifying function on them for some properties where damp and condensation also has to be factored. That's worth considering that technology. I would also add in, when we start to think about decarbonising heat, there are a number of alternatives. In the sort of national press, you'll see lots about hydrogen. Personally, I think hydrogen is a long way off yet, and is possibly something of a distraction. For those who are using oil as a source of heating, one alternative that is coming forward is what's called HVO. That's hydro-treated vegetable oil. And there are trials going on in Cornwall as we speak to convert traditional kerosene oil boilers to HVO as a way of decarbonising. Mitchell and Webber will claim HVO is a 90% reduction in carbon emissions compared to standard heating oil. HVO is treated vegetable oil, usually taken from waste oil from the food industry. So it has some advantages in terms of recycling a waste product. At the moment, it's still very expensive as a fuel, but potentially, I think, has opportunities, particularly if we could stop ripping out all these perfectly good oil boilers that are functioning well, adapt them to HVO rather than take them out and put more expensive heating systems in, which maybe don't work quite as well. But as we're talking about changing heat, I think there's 3 points I wanted just to mention in the context. One is we've had a period over the past 10 years or so where as soon as we start to talk about renewables, the conversation turns to about what's the payback period for them. I have a bit of a problem with that, because if we're putting a heating system in, the point of the heating system, it's about providing the warmth at an affordable cost. It's not about making money. What we've struggled with, I think, because we've had things like the renewable heat incentive and the feed-in tariff, particularly for solar PV on roofs, is people have seen it as a technology that they could get a return on investment from. The reason you put a heating system in is to provide heat, and you've got to make the case for that provision, but it's not about a payback period. The other thing I would say is the government, particularly when Mrs. May was Prime Minister, and I think it was followed up when Mr. Johnson also was Prime Minister, the promise that we were going to have no new gas boilers put in, that created a whole load of uncertainty. And certainly in terms of our advice service, we met people who had, I think, quite unwisely reacted to that and taken out perfectly good gas boilers and put in heating systems that weren't really fit for purpose, and then we're struggling with the cost. There is going to be a change. We are going to see mains gas changed, and it may mean our boilers need to be adapted. But even if we have a ban on new boilers going in, that means on new build only. We've still got a fleet of existing gas boilers that are going to be around for quite some time yet. And so there isn't a need to panic about, am I going to have gas provided, and do I need to do something immediately? The answer is no. I would say with all of our heating systems, they do have a lifespan. We need to start planning for the point when it's time to upgrade. So that may be in 5 years' time, and starting to make plans for an upgrade in 5 to 7 years would be quite reasonable. And at that time, there will still be gas boilers available if gas is the best solution for the property you're managing. But it is a point to start to think about the alternatives rather than immediately switch to something that may not have quite the reliability that you need. I think I will stop at that point. I can go into more detail if it's helpful to you, but I think possibly on the call it's going to be about who's got some questions. So if I can
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim. That was really interesting. I have to confess, I hadn't even heard of smart plugs, so I've certainly learned something today. So it's really clear that we've got a fantastic expert in the room with us this lunchtime. So we've allocated about 10 minutes for questions at this point before we hear from Mike. So I think the best thing is if you either want to put your question in the chat, or there's not too many of us, so have a go at unmuting, and if it's chaos, we'll change our our plans. But okay, it looks like Andrew's got his actual hand up. Would you like to go first, Andrew, with your question?
It's not a really question, it's an update. HVO, Mitchell and Webber have done an intensive programme in Kehilland, including the chapel at Kehilland. Before Christmas, we had a meeting with George Eustace about the subject of that, and he has last week put forward a 10-minute bill. The problem with HVO is not the material itself, it's the taxation regime.
I'd say, yeah.
And if that was put right, then HVO would be a very good economic alternative.
Absolutely.
And he's very much taken on board the fact that for places like chapels, the need is for short periods of intense heat, as distinct from domestic, where quite a low grade heat can be acceptable, provided it's there for long periods of time. So HVO is quite exciting. The other thing is interesting to hear you say about the extended life of gas boilers, because by the time they come to the end of their life, we may well see a sufficient growth in green hydrogen. Because if we're getting more and more wind and solar, there are times even now when we produce too much of it, and that can be used to produce the green hydrogen being what's produced by using renewable energy rather than any sort of chemical or process or extraction method. Got a couple more things, but I'll stop at that point for a minute.
Thank you, Andrew. Tim, did you want to come back on anything there around the taxation of HVO?
I can do. So personally, I confess I am a complete skeptic about the hype around hydrogen. We will probably get about 20%, Charmian's agreeing with me. We will probably get about 20%. I think that's the maximum that can be put into the mains gas supply. So mains gas can be decarbonized. But the problem with a higher rate of hydrogen is it's just the basic physics the chemistry of hydrogen compared to methane, hydrogen leaks because it's a much smaller molecule. And if we were to upgrade everything to hydrogen, so it was working solely on hydrogen, we would have to have the whole of the mains gas network replaced. And I can't see we will ever get that level of investment as we had it previously with the dash to gas in the sort of 80s when mains gas replaced town gas. But the chemistry and the physics of hydrogen supply is incredibly complicated, so it's going to be a problem. On the HVO thing, Andrew, you're entirely right. At the moment, HVO is taxed as a fuel for transport, not a fuel for heating. And so I'm really encouraged that George Eustace has got on board with that. I know various of the suppliers, not just Mitchell and Webber, have been pushing for this. If we can get the taxation changed, then we will certainly see some progress on getting it as a fuel, at least at the very least, a transition fuel for people who are using domestic heating oil to transition to something much more low carbon. So I think it's an area that Cornwall should be enthusiastically supporting.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. Would anyone else like to raise their hand with a question? Oh, I understand that Steve has a question, Sam says. Steve, over to you, sorry.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what was said about hydrogen. If you're banking on hydrogen, you're backing the wrong horse. The stuff is so reactive that it'll, if you've got anything in your boiler which reacts with hydrogen, it will just erode it. Okay, and the size of the molecule is so small, it tends to leak everywhere. Also, it's enormously explosive as well. So it is, there's a whole load of issues around hydrogen, which, you know, and a lot of this, unfortunately, the messaging is being propagated by the Blue Hydrogen Brigade, which is part of the oil and gas industry. So don't believe it.
Okay, thanks for the warning, Steve. We've got a question in the chat from David. I think I'm officially out of my depths now when with this conversation. So David's asking, can hydrogen not be used like a battery, storing energy for it to be converted back into electricity when needed? Tim, is that something you can speak to?
I've deliberately avoided mentioning energy storage at this point. It may be appropriate for some, but yeah, the technology for hydrogen storage is a way off in terms of the scale that we're talking about. Maybe at larger industrial scales it may work. In terms of other battery options, we are seeing the growth of the market for domestic batteries. Again, I still think that for most people the economics doesn't work unless you are going to be thinking about living in an off-grid situation. If you can get electricity from a main supply at the moment, batteries, it's a difficult case to make in most circumstances. Having said that, it may be that some sort of community buildings, if you've got a big enough PV array on the roof, depending on the usage of the buildings, a battery may work, but it's technologies that come with a heavy cost. So that will probably be the key factor.
Thank you, Tim. So before we move on to Mike's presentation, does anybody else want to fire a question at Tim at this point? I've got one more from Andrew. Go for it, Andrew.
It's not too much of a question, and again, it's more an observation. Tim talked there about insulating through the roof. There is an article in the paper this weekend about roof insulation with applied spray-on foam. And in a nutshell, it'll probably make your house unsaleable, yes, unmortgageable, exactly, and virtually valueless. So do not go heading for spray-on foam under the roof to insulate anything.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. That unfortunately, we've had to support a number of clients who are really have got themselves into a very difficult situation. Spray foam insulation does work in some very limited situations, but certainly as insulation in loft spaces, it should be avoided because it creates all sorts of problems. And as Andrew's just said, it potentially could make a property unmortgageable. And we've certainly got experience of that with a client in Cornwall. I'm just looking at the chat as well. Information about funding environment in relation to community energy networks. The funding environment at the moment is very tough. So if you're looking for grants, it is quite difficult. Although obviously this is in the context of Transformation Cornwall's Meet the Funder. Funding for church buildings is slightly different from community spaces, and it may be that there are options that you can consider because there are trusts and foundations that will support churches and people who are looking to promote church life particularly, and it maybe Mike can comment on that given your experience and contacts.
And we, at the end of the session, I will share a list of funders that we've pulled together. That doesn't mean, as Tim says, that it's easy to get the money out of them, but we have at least pulled together a resource of people to approach. I think there was one more question before we hand over to Mike. So Alan says he's interested in the emphasis on stopping heat loss through walls and particularly reducing water penetration. What is good for listed buildings?
I think I'd probably want to ask some questions about the specifics for that, but obviously in terms of speaking generally, and the advice sheet I pointed to from the council touches on this, for the longevity of a building and to look after a building, you want to reduce water coming in from the outside. So again, going back to the very basics, and it's surprising how often we have to do this. Things like, do you have a good maintenance regime to keep the water out, or keep the water where it's supposed to be? So in the gutters and not running down walls, and earth being banked up against walls over damp proof courses if you've got them. Appreciate older buildings, so they may not have damp proof courses, but all those sort of very simple, should be simple reminders are important in terms of maintaining the health of a wall. If you've got walls that are facing prevailing winds and whether they get lots of rain on them, the resistance of that wall to water is the key bit that you've got to address. And there are treatments that you can put on walls, but again, if it's a listed building, there are sort of some restrictions on that of what you can and can't do. And down here, obviously, we've got lots of properties that are local Cornish stone. If it's good, a good Cornish granite, brilliant, as long as it's well maintained. I think one of the bits that we're all learning, if we go back maybe sort of 30, 40 years ago, understanding of lime renders and pointing was perhaps a bit thin on the ground. We have some excellent companies working in Cornwall now that understand how you make a wall breathe. So you don't cover it in concrete, so it can't, the water can't move through, the air can't move through as it should. But people like Cornish Lime and Mike Y, who work up in, I think they're based up in the north of Devon, have got brilliant track records of understanding how to properly conserve buildings. So the specifics of a building, I think, is the starting point of that.
Great, thank you very much, Tim, for that. As always with these workshops, it's probably the start of a conversation with various organisations bouncing off from here. Okay, if it's all right with you, Mike, I think I will hand over for you to share your screen and begin your presentation. Thank you very much again for stepping in.
That's okay, and welcome everybody. So yes, it's a little bit of a last minute. Can I pick up? It was a shame. I was quite looking forward to what Brian was going to be saying, but you'll have to put up with me, I'm afraid. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey we've taken at Liskeard. So this is Liskeard Church and our church centre. So if we take a look now, let's just move on. There we go. Yeah. So we have got 3 buildings. So in the centre of the picture there is St Martin's Church. It's the second biggest parish church in Cornwall after Bodmin. It's got a capacity of 550 people and it's grade 2 star listed. And then as you move down and you look into the bottom left with the circles, we've got what was St Martin's School. And you can see 2 halls. So the upper hall is in the top left picture, and then down in the bottom right you can see the lower hall. So the upper hall is grade 2, not 2 star, just grade 2. As far as we're aware, the lower hall is not listed. So we have a sort of complete mix of the buildings that we've got there. And we started a journey towards trying to become a little bit more efficient and sustainable back in 2012, when we put 15 kilowatts of solar array on the roof. So, I mean, this wasn't done as an investment. So I could pick up on Tim's point. We just wanted to make it be a little bit more sustainable, but there were some really good feed-in tariffs. Unfortunately, with a listed building, you have to go through either listed planning consent, or in the Church of England, we have a faculty regime which takes its place. And we missed 2 feed-in tariffs deadlines whilst we were going through that process. But it's still quite a good sort of investment from us, but that's not why we did it. But we average about £2,300 a year of income from that. And it also helps us, as we'll see a little bit later on, in our heating process. Back in 2018, we were looking to do a lot of work with our church. We started a church reordering. You can see the sort of the old picture there. It was very dark, full of pews. And we wanted to make it a lot more flexible so that it could be used much more as a community building. We did all the quick wins before we started that, which is, replace the old lighting with LED. We signed up for a renewable energy supplier, but we needed to go a lot further. So we started this reordering process, and it was rather strange when we, let's see if, there we go, rather strange to see diggers in the church. So the church was literally closed. Prior to doing this work, and one of the things that we sort of pushed us into it, we had a really old 40-year-old gas boiler system, and it would heat air and blow air out into the church from 2 big grills, and they kept breaking down. And they got to the point where we would no longer able to repair them, and we had 2 years where in the winters we decamped from the church into the church halls, and we shut the church because we just had no heating at all in the church. So as part of this process, we needed to look quite carefully. We stripped out the pews. Underneath the pews were sat on a wooden frame. And underneath it, you'd have a 6 to 18-inch drop to bare earth. So it was ideal in the sense for looking at underfloor heating. So as part of it, we put in a modern boiler. It's still gas. I mean, this was in 2018. And if for those of you who know the sort of familiar with the Church of England, the General Synod of the Church of England didn't vote until February 2020 on this target of net zero by 2030. So we sort of got a fairly new gas boiler in, and we're not going to be doing anything with that until we're sort of way down the line, if then, and as Tim was saying, if we can get some decent renewables on it. So we have the gas is our main one. All the underfloor heating was laid in there, and we have a secondary one where when we generate electricity from the solar panels, that sort of heats up a big tank of water, which is then used to help with underfloor heating. Of course, when you need heating most, you don't have much sun. So, you know, the gas is our primary source of heating that we're looking at there. So, as I said, this is a huge building, and it's effectively a medieval barn. I mean, the church started, we can go back to 1450. And then they added on a few extra bits, they added on some extra aisles, and then they added on a lady chapel. But it is a massive building, and it has no insulation whatsoever, apart from when we laid the underfloor heating, we put insulation beneath it so that we weren't heating the ground. So we have stained glass windows, single pane. I nearly went, it was slightly joking, but I had a conversation with somebody in the diocese about, oh, would it be okay for us to put in secondary double glazing against stained glass windows? And I thought I had to go and find a defibrillator that looks like the person was about to have a heart attack. So, you know, there's a limit to what we're allowed to do with a building like this. And as we can see on the slide, we were with a renewable electricity supplier. We were in the energy basket from the parish buying. And we had a new contract come in on the 1st of October when the new prices kicked in. And if I carried on using it in the same way, using our energy in the same way, we would have gone from £10,000 energy costs a year to 34,000. To be blunt, we didn't have £34,000 to spend on energy. So we used to, in order to maintain this building as a community building that could be used, and it was used not just on Sundays, it was used throughout the week, we kept the heating at 18 degrees. And that's expensive in a medieval barn. But we were doing it primarily, this is a building that we want people to feel comfortable coming into. When the prices went through the roof, we just looked and said, we cannot do that anymore. So as part of our heating system, we have got an app, so I can sit here in my home, log into the app, and it allows us to set the temperatures in the 2 zones. We have a small bit in what we call the parish room, which is off to a side, but then the main church building is one big area. And we can have 4 settings a day, and we can then have the whole week planned out. So what we started doing is, when we're not using, we move pretty well everything out of the church into our church halls, which are still expensive to heat, but cheaper than the church building. And we pretty well just keep the church now for over winter for church services and big events. We do still have some concerts and some plays and things like that. We run church fairs and other events in the church. And the diocese has run synods there, and I think Transformation Cornwall has run Meet the Funding there, Meet the Funders. So we can set this, we started before Christmas with a base temperature where we would reduce it down to 10 degrees. And that was great. And it's we can see it, you'll see later in the energy readings that we're getting. And then we would build it up towards the when we needed it for the services. But the problem is we had 2 things that we needed to keep it. One was Thursday and one was Sunday. And it can take 2 days to warm this building. And when it's freezing outside, you just cannot warm this building. You know, we could get it up to about 13, 14 degrees when it was freezing. Even when we were keeping it 18 degrees before the price rises came in, when it got freezing outside, people would come in and say, oh, has the heating failed? You know, we got a problem. And the answer is no, we are just shucking heat out of the windows, the roof, the walls, and everywhere that Tim was talking about. If we now, so that was our church. If we now look to our church hall complex, we've got those 2 buildings that I said, but we have much of the same problems. We have an upper hall, which is grade 2 listed. So we're allowed to do a little bit more with that. And we have been in contact with Historic England and to try and make sure that anything we are thinking about doing is okay with them. And we have a 160-year-old roof on there. I mean, it's got patches on patches on patches. And we're getting water coming into the building through the walls, through guttering. There's big project that we need to be doing on this. So we have actually started on a project. We've got architects have drawn up some plans for us. We're about to go out and get costings. The architect's gut feeling was this is, I mean, the good news is it looks like it'll start with a 1. The bad news is it looks like it could be 6 figures after it. You know, this is quite an expensive job, and we spent most of our reserves on the church. So this is everything we're looking at doing is all very much going to be subject to our faculty regime, because the upper hall is now a place of worship. So it comes under the Church of England faculty rather than the listed buildings consent. But we are looking at replacing that roof. The slates on there, those that are good will be probably better than anything we can get today. So it'll be probably take it off and relay it, which means we're going to have scaffolding all around the building. Whilst we're doing that, we are looking at adding in all the insulation it was Tim was talking about on the roof, solar panels, because we've got the scaffolding there, and sort out all of the guttering. So our primary concern in phase 2, if you like, phase 1 was let's look at some design. And we did quite a bit of work with the users of the hall. What is it you want? What are you trying to achieve? And put all of that together and gave that as a design brief to the architects. So phase 2 is to basically stop the water ingress and get the roof set up. And whilst we're doing it, there are certain things we've got the scaffolding we'll need to do whilst that's in place. But that's not going to stop the energy coming out through the walls, as Tim was saying. So we're looking at, we won't be able to put stuff on the outside, or at least not that we're aware of, unless Tim can give me some advice later on. But we're looking at probably putting in internal wall insulation, secondary double glazing, and then replace the old gas boiler, hopefully with air source heat pumps. They can work, but as Tim was suggesting, they only really work if you've got an insulated building. Then we've got other stuff that we're going to be doing. We want to upgrade all the toilets, put in a commercial kitchen, high-speed Wi-Fi throughout all the buildings, extra meeting spaces. We're looking at putting in a mezzanine floor. But in terms of the energy on these 2 buildings, we've got an opportunity to do stuff while we're doing this major reordering, assuming we can get the funding to help us do that. Given the way that we've used, and this is the position here on the top right, we have an energy toolkit. We measure for the Church of England energy footprints, and because we're a big church, the right hand of those graphs, which puts us down the bottom, says we're one of the bigger churches, because basically it says our energy usage is bigger than 90% of Church of England churches. Well, that's not surprising because we're a major church. And on the left-hand side of that top right is the actual usage that we're looking at. And it's considerable, because we were running this we want a warm building, so we're running it at 24/7. Now that we're changing that. So our gas usage in the church in 2021 was 182 megawatt hours. 182,000 kilowatt hours. And bear in mind, in 2021, at the beginning, we had lockdown. So we didn't actually have the building open, and the heating was pretty much turned off. This year, because of what we've been doing, and we've only been doing it for 3 months, our energy usage has dropped to 117 megawatt hours in the church. When we're looking at our total usage, though, because what we have done is we've moved stuff into the halls, and we've been heating the halls more. And of course, 2021 had the lockdown. The overall has gone down from 245 megawatt hours to 203. So that's a 17% reduction, and we've only really been working on this for 3 months. So when you look at the left-hand graph there, that shows our energy usage, bearing in mind 2020, 2021 had lockdown periods in there. But you can see that actually this year, with the steps we've been taking, our energy usage has gone down quite a bit. Unfortunately, when you look at the graph at the bottom, That's the cost in pounds. So even though our energy usage has gone down by 17%, we've had a 50% increase in our costs. And that's having taken all the steps that we've taken to try and reduce what we can. The only other thing I'd really want to look at is it's in a sense not connected with our buildings, but we have taken out a lease, a 7-year lease on a recreational field. It's owned by the Education Department of Cornwall Council. And this is primarily because it sits between the church school and 2 new housing estates. And we're looking at putting in a community garden, an orchard, and doing other work there. It will primarily stay as a recreational ground for the estates, though. But I have to confess that I had looked at it and thought, well, this may well give me some opportunity for offset. The reality is I didn't understand offset well enough to that's not going to happen. You know, if we're looking at tree planting, you know, to start with, it's probably 10 years after you plant a tree before anything will happen. You've got to pass a whole pile of rules about additionality. You know, you can't, as I was hoping, claim for the carbon that's being absorbed by the trees that are already there. So I think my dreams of offset from this extra piece of land just went out the window when I started investigating offsetting a little bit more. But nevertheless, we will be planting some stuff, and you know, it will help a bit. And we're doing a lot on biodiversity, going to be doing that there as well. So that's kind of a bit of our journey. We've got a long way to go, and it is difficult with listed buildings, but at least we're trying to do what we can. We will never, though, get to net zero with those buildings. Yeah, it's just not going to be feasible. So there will always be, we'll do what we can, but there will always be a need for offset. So any questions? I will stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mike. I'm sure that people who are on this call who are also managing buildings will have found that inspiring and perhaps a bit scary in equal measure, but it's great to know that you're already on that journey. So yeah, let's open up for questions both to Tim again and to Mike. We've got one from David in the chat to start us off. Have you looked at methane capture from your field, Mike?
No, David, I haven't. We signed the lease just before Christmas, having taken 6 months negotiating with the council over the, yes, we will do the minor repairs, but if there's tree work or walls down, that's your job, council. So we haven't started looking at that. We haven't started with the putting in the community garden or anything like that at this stage. David, you and I know each other. Any advice you've got on that, I would be grateful to receive it.
Great, thank you, David. Andrew, would you like to come in now?
Thank you. One of the things that was very interesting that Mike said, and incidentally, congratulations on your presentation, Mike, at short notice. Thank you very much. You said about internal insulation, and it's something that I hadn't really thought about, although I very much considered the problem of thermal mass within church buildings. If you actually take the mass of all the chairs and how much energy is used just to raise their temperature, and the same thing goes for the solid walls. So if we can have internal insulation, when we do try and heat the building for relatively short periods, we are not trying to heat blooming great thick granite walls, which will take a week and a day, as you well know, to warm up. So yes, I think that's something that we need to look at a little bit more carefully. The other thing I would pick up on is the question of your renewable tariff. An excellent thing for be doing, because it sends the message we want to be environmentally friendly. But at the end of the day, when you plug in, any of us, when we plug in the kettle, the sun doesn't shine anymore, the wind doesn't blow any harder. Someone somewhere is having to throw another lump of coal on the fire to generate that electricity, because still about 40% of our electricity comes from fossil fuels. And so any extra demand is always met from fossil fuels.
Yes, I mean, to pick up on those, the internal insulation is going to be in our halls. I'm not sure we'd get permission to do something on the church. The main advice for churches is to heat the people, not the building. And so you may know there's things now where you can get these little jackets that you can plug in. They've got heating systems in the gilets. You just stick them on. If you've only got a dozen people turning up on a Sunday, you know, that's a much more efficient way of heating the process. But we've got, you know, on a Sunday we'll have 250 people in our church in some weeks. You know, we have events where we can have 300-400 people there. In our remembrance service, which is probably one of the biggest, you know, you got 500. So that's not an option with that sort of numbers. So we actually do need to heat it. You're absolutely right. When we come to look at when we were heating it for 18 degrees right the way, you know, we never changed the settings. You know, it was just kept at 18 degrees. Then you built up a heat mass within the pillars in the building and things like that, which helped when you wanted to sort of just, if you ever did lose it, it helped bring it back up. And one of the things I think we've got at the moment is by dropping the temperature, we lose that heat mass. And so you're trying to heat the whole lot up again. I mean, underfloor heating makes sort of night storage look like rapid reaction, you know, in a building like ours. It does take a long time to bring up the mass again.
Right, thank you very much, Mike. Shall we go to Steve now?
Yeah, thanks for that presentation. It was very informative. Filled me with horror, actually. But we're coming from a completely different perspective or different position in Saltash. Fortunately, we've got a very modern building, well insulated, double glazed, south facing, ideal for solar, etc. But I've yet to hear anybody who successfully put in recent times, so excluding the FIT payment and all the rest of it, put a solar system on the building together with heat pumps that actually still wipes its face, you know, the business case. Yeah, it's currently, and I put all the figures together, and you know, even putting a £50,000 investment into the church with a 22 kilowatt solar array, 3 heat pumps, and we've ticked all the other boxes relating to, you know, insulation and switching things off, etc., like that. We still can't get it to pay the bills.
Yeah,
So,
it is a decision. I mean, I have to say, in my home here, it's a large 5-bedroomed house. We've got air source heat pump. We've got 20 kilowatts of solar panels on. We've got batteries because we've got electric car, and we are just pure electric. And it is very noticeable this winter with the higher bills that are coming in. You know, how much with the smart meter you're looking at and think, oh, that's interesting. Bear in mind that with the higher bills, your payback period, and I know Tim was not a great fan of payback periods, but we all tend to look at them, they're suddenly becoming a little bit more affordable. Although, of course, the cost of electricity has gone up as well. Yeah, you have to make a decision as to, can you A, afford to put the stuff in, and B, can you afford to run it once it's in there? But at least you've got all the energy efficiency that you can on the walls and that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Tim.
Yeah, I would just make the comment because I didn't include it in what I said earlier. Probably about 10 years ago, we put a biomass boiler into the village hall where I am in Grandpound Road, and that's been working very successfully over that period, and we've proven the case that biomass can work. So that was a biomass boiler with a wet central heating system attached to it. That obviously doesn't work everywhere, but for the village location where we're at, it's I think it's grade 2 listed, arts and crafts village hall. So there were some sensitivities to it. It was a 35 kilowatt boiler that was put onto a basically not quite a shed, but an outhouse type setting alongside the hall, and that's worked very well. So for some settings, biomass can be a solution rather than heat pumps. But I was intrigued in the pictures you showed, Mike. You said for the church halls you were looking at air source. You've got a nice big car park by the looks of it. My automatic question would be,
Why not ground source?
Yeah.
Well, particularly since part of the project is to extend the car park, so we will be doing work on that, and we have car park which is breaking up and would need to be redone. So yeah, ground source is a real possibility.
And the reality is, the government have focused on air source because it's cheaper the ground source, and the key difference is the cost of putting a borehole or a slinky horizontally under the ground. Ground source works more efficiently and will always be more efficient than air source.
Yeah.
And so, if the money and the opportunity presents, like having to do car park works and putting a ground source loop under a car park, taking the advantage of that, it does shout to be make use of that.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you, Tim. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question of Tim or Mike at this point? I'm sure. Fantastic. Rowley, would you like to come in?
I'm quite interested in talking about efficiency between air source and ground source heat pumps. Is there a sort of, like you would say, oh, it's going to cost you 10,000 for air source? What is the percentage extra for putting a borehole or piping in if you've got sufficient ground to do that?
The comparison I make is based on currently the government is offering the boiler upgrade scheme for domestic properties to put heat pumps in. So this is government stats. They are showing air source heat pumps typically going in between 12 and 15,000, and a ground source starts at 28,000 and above, typically sort of 35 for a typical domestic property. Obviously, if you're looking at a bigger array, a bigger heat pump and the ground array to feed that for a larger building, then obviously those prices will go up. But those prices I've just quoted would be the sort of typical for a standard domestic property.
Thank you.
Is there an issue with how close it has to be to the building, or can you have a run? So we have a piece of land next to our car park, which we're going to use as an extended car park, but that's at the moment is not car park at all. So could we run a pipe right the way out to that? And you'll be talking sort of 20, 30, 40 yards before you get to the array.
I can't see that would be a problem. Obviously, the longer your pipes, you've got more cost in terms of the pipe work. But the key bit is the pumping the fluid through the array to get to the heat exchanger. It depends on where your heat exchanger is, and then from the heat exchanger through into the heat distribution system, whether that's a system of radiators or, as you say, underfloor can work in some settings. Underfloor heating is probably the bit that where insulating the walls is the most critical bit. I mean, I think the interesting bit when we start to talk about energy and church buildings is obviously typically, and the pictures you showed, Mike, of your main church space, it's the simple reality of the physics of heat. Heat rises, and all of our buildings have a nice high roof space. And I often walk into churches and think, wouldn't it be great if we could have a system where we put a glass cap to where the people are, because that will keep the heat where the people are, and that nice big open space above that, you know, the nice woodwork and the rafters, great, but it doesn't help us when we're trying to keep people warm.
We when we put the solar panels on, we had to before we could get a feed-in tariff, we had to get an EPC.
Yeah.
And I spoke to the guy and said, look, it's a medieval barn, just give us the lowest one. Oh, you'd be surprised, he said. And we got, I can't remember what the level was, but we were just below the next level. And I said, well, what do we need to do to improve it? And he said, well, in a building like this with a high roof, you put in a stratification system. So basically fans that forces the hot air down. And I said, oh, great, how many fans? He said, it just says fans. I said, that's 2 then. So we bought a couple of fans from Trago Mills and stuck them in the church out of the bell tower and got up a level. But it doesn't really work as a stratification system to get the heat down from the roof. It just got us up to the next level. We'd already missed 2. We didn't want to miss another one. So yeah, that's another possibility you might want to think about in an old church. But you know, unless you are using the building throughout the week, let's come back to look at heating the people rather than, you know, heating the. And we put in some under pew heaters for the choir because there was no heating in their area, and other people have these sort of so infrared type, not infrared, but the radiators that sit above and just heat the people, and they're quite effective. Or even just buy a bunch of blankets and hand them out. And if you're only really using the church on a Sunday for a couple of hours, you know, that's it's not a big issue.
Great. Thank you very much again, Mike. Always a good sign when Trago Mills gets a mention on a workshop, I feel. I am going to say this is a final chance for one more question. If anyone is quietly thinking, oh, I should ask, you will be able to contact our speakers via their presentations, I'm sure. So this isn't your final chance to ask a question, and you might want to go away and think about things a little bit more. Looks like, have I missed any questions, Sam? Oh, we have got a question from Alan. Great, Alan, this is going to be the last question of the day. Go for it.
Thank you. We're not just a listed building, but also we're right on the edge of an area of outstanding natural beauty. We would love to do things like put in solar panels and actually to put in the small wind turbine as well. There used to be one and it's still on the Ordnance Survey maps, but we wonder whether in an area of outstanding natural beauty, both of those would be immediately cut out as not allowed.
I wouldn't make that assumption at all. Certainly AONB in Cornwall have been very open to the opportunity. They want to be consulted, they want it to be thought about, but I certainly would be wanting to sort of point you to talk to them, because from an AONB point of view, having the landscaped occupied and used properly is more their priority than it being just left pristine. So if there's ways to have buildings that are properly occupied and, you know, they're affordable and providing the service for which you're, you know, want to occupy them for, then there shouldn't necessarily be a problem. And even with wind, we've had conversations with AONB where they're not necessarily talking about agreeing to a big, massive commercial turbine, but something that's appropriate to scale. That conversation has definitely moved on to be something that's worth having conversation. Probably depending on the scale, but obviously at the moment there is an issue. The government haven't quite got over the threshold yet to allow us to be talking about putting turbines up at scale, much to Charmian's annoyance, I know. We might get there eventually, but the moratorium that's currently on large commercial turbines onshore, it will get lifted at some point. So it's then having a discussion about it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and
Okay.
Alan, I would agree. When you're looking at putting the panels on our church, solar panels on our church, at the time they had to be hidden. So we have, you may have spotted a sort of factory style roof. So the solar panels couldn't be on the southmost one; they were on the next two lots in. So you can that was a drone photo that I used, or you can see them from the top of the tower, but you can't see them from the ground. And I suspect that they are becoming a lot more understanding now. Everybody's shouting about this. So I wouldn't make any assumptions to what you can and can't do. Go for it. They can only say no.
Brilliant. Well, that's a positive note, I think, for us to end our Q&A on. So thank you very much for that. And just once again, on behalf of all of us, a really big thank you to Tim and Mike. I'm just going to share a couple of quick slides before we finish today. Can you see my slides, Sam? Great, thank you. Okay, can I move them? Yes. So as promised earlier on in the session, after today, I am going to email you all this document, which is a list of funding advice, and it starts off with some links to the Church of England's 3 webinars on environmental fundraising, which are incredibly thorough and are led by a top professional fundraiser who's got a real wealth of experience in fundraising for projects with an environmental angle. So those are worth a watch if you're embarking on looking for some funding. Also in the document is a link to the Church of England's list of environmental grant providers. Again, it doesn't matter if you're not a church, that list is still worth looking at, and it's carefully divided up into the types of projects that will be funded, so energy, engagement with environmental issues, water, etc. Our own grants list is also linked from this document, and you can search that. It's a PDF, but you can put in your key terms and quickly find the funders who are interested in your project area. So I'll make sure that goes out to you later on. As promised, we will share the 2 presentations with you as well. And we're always keen to support you one-to-one, so do get in touch with Transformation Cornwall after this session if you would like to talk to us further. 2 adverts to finish with. We're really excited that after a 2 years of online events, the famous Transformation Cornwall Meet the Funders event, which Mike mentioned was once hosted in Liskeard Church, I believe, is coming back on the 27th of April. We will send out a booking link in the next week. We're just finalising the details, but please do put the 27th of April in your diaries. If you've not been to a Meet the Funders event before, it does what it says on the tin. We've got some national funders already booked, as well as some Cornish funders who you will have the chance to hear from both in presentations, but also in a one-to-one sort of mingling and networking session. And then finally, just to let you know, we had a reference from Mike to the Church of England's goal of being net carbon neutral by 2030, and the diocese are about to run 5 workshops across the year delving into this important topic. The first one is going to be on Thursday the 9th, not of January, of February, and I will include a booking link to that in my email as well. And I understand that one of the sessions will involve gathering at a church and a drone being used to examine, to gather footage from the roof, etc. So it sounds quite exciting and interactive. What I'm going to do now is put a link to a Google form in the chat, which is our evaluation for today. So if you've got time to stay online and fill that in now, that would be the best possible thing for you to do. But I will also include a link to that in my follow-up email if you don't have time to do it now. So let's just see if I can do that now. Let's see, still in my clipboard. Yes, it is. Okay, so there is your Google form to tell us your thoughts on today's webinar. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for being patient with me as I've stepped in at the last minute. Thank you again, Tim and Mike. Thank you, Sam, for your technical support, and you will hear from us very soon with all the things that we've promised to send you. Thank you very much, everybody. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Yeah.